Good evening, and welcome to Englebrook Independent News Federal Crime Report. I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Tonight, we take you across Northeast United States as federal prosecutors announce a wave of major criminal cases involving child exploitation, narcotic trafficking, terrorism allegations, gang violence, international drug smuggling, fraud scheme targeting elderly Americans, ghost gun trafficking, and organized criminal enterprises stretching from New England to the Canadian border. Federal investigators say many of these cases demonstrate the increased sophistication of organized crime networks operating inside the United States. While prosecutors continue warning about the devastating rise of fentanyl, online child exploitation, and violent gang activity, tonight's report includes developments from Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. We begin tonight in Maine. Federal prosecutors in Maine announced that 35-year-old Darren Wood Peterson of Portland has been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for distributing and possession of child pornography. U.S. District Judge Stacey D. Newman also ordered Wood Peterson to serve 10 years of supervised release and pay more than $56,000 in restitution to victims whose abuse images were found in his possession. According to federal court records, investigators traced payment of Wood Peterson made through Cash App tied to links containing child sexual abuse material. In December of 2024, FBI agents executed a search warrant at his residence and seized two cell phones containing thousands of images and videos depicting child sexual abuse. Investigators say Wood Peterson admitted to viewing, accessing, and distributing the material online. A forensic review of his device revealed repeat distribution activity through the Telegram messaging platform. Federal officials continue warning that encrypted message applications remain a significant tool for online child exploitation networks. In another disturbing case from Maine, 39-year-old Neil Wing of Waterville was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison after attempting to transfer obscene material to what he believed to be a 12-year-old girl. According to prosecutors, Wing began communicating through the Kik messaging application with an undercover detective posing as a minor. Investigators say the conversations quickly turned sexual. Wing allegedly requested photographs from the undercover officer before sending a sexually illicit image of himself. When authorities executed a search warrant at his residence, Wing admitted to sending the image. Judge Stacey D. Newman sentenced Wing to nearly 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Federal prosecutors also announced the sentencing of 33-year-old Bradley Belfer of Bangor to 6 years in federal prison for conspiring to distribute fentanyl. Investigators say Belfer was enrolled in Penobscot Community Adult Treatment and Recovery Court following a prior burglary conviction when authorities received information that he was actively trafficking fentanyl. A search of the residence uncovered fentanyl and trafficking paraphernalia. Cell phone evidence reportedly showed Belfer coordinating with suppliers from Massachusetts to regularly move fentanyl into Bangor area. Federal officials say the case highlights how fentanyl trafficking continues to infiltrate communities nationwide. In Vermont, federal prosecutors announced 31-year-old Kyle Pickett of Windsor County has been sentenced to 53 months in federal prison after being caught with a loaded stolen firearm while driving a stolen pickup truck. Authorities say Pickett possessed two stolen Winchester firearms while operating a stolen Ford Ranger in Stamford, Vermont. When officers attempted to stop the vehicle, prosecutors say Pickett fled at high speed through a residential neighborhood. Because of prior felony convictions, including a previous conviction for eluding police, Pickett was legally prohibited from possessing a firearm. Chief U.S. District Judge Christina Rise sentenced Pickett to more than 4 years in federal prison. Federal prosecutors in Vermont also announced charges against Todd Javarius and Kylie Brown following a DEA investigation into fentanyl and crack cocaine trafficking. Authorities say Javarius had been under surveillance after investigators learned he was making frequent trips between Vermont and New York City. During a traffic stop in Selburne, investigators allegedly found more than 500 grams of suspected cocaine base and 24 grams of suspected fentanyl on Javarius. Searches later conducted at the couple's Woonsocket apartment reportedly uncovered additional narcotic and trafficking material. Javarius remains detained pending trial. Another Vermont has involved Joshua Barrett of Waterbury, accused of trafficking cocaine while armed with a loaded revolver. Investigators say Berber distributed cocaine and cocaine base throughout the Brattleboro region during April of 2026. At this time of his arrest, authorities discovered approximately 400 grams of cocaine and loaded revolver inside a rental vehicle. Federal prosecutors allege the firearm was possessed in furtherance of drug trafficking activity. Federal prosecutors in New Hampshire announced that 49-year-old Donald Estee of Bath has been sentenced to 21 months in prison for stealing more than $225,000 from an elderly disabled veteran. According to prosecutors, the victim resided in a nursing home and lacked the ability to manage his own finances. Authorities say Estee gained access to the victim's bank account and systematically drained disabled benefit payments between 2020 and 2023. Investigators say the stolen money funded luxury purchases including jewelry, vacations, and a snowmobile. The court ordered Estee to pay the full amount. Federal authorities also announced interstate kidnapping charges against DeMarcus Boner and Tyrone Harris. Investigators allege the two men kidnapped a victim in Claremont, New Hampshire, and transported her across state lines in Vermont, where she was held against her will for more than 24 hours. Authorities say the victim was beaten, tortured, and held for ransom. When police entered the residence in Springfield, Vermont, investigators discovered firearms, narcotics, and duct tape allegedly used to restrain the victim, and other items described as torture instruments. One of the most significant federal investigations announced this week involves a sprawling international firearm trafficking network operating between New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, and Canada. Federal prosecutors say 13 individuals have now been charged in connection with conspiracy that trafficked firearms throughout Okazaki Mohawk Reservation into Canada. Investigators say straw purchasers acquired firearms from federally licensed dealerships in New Hampshire before smuggling them north across the border. Authorities say at least 51 firearms tied to the conspiracy were recovered at the Canadian crime scene involving kidnapping and attempted murder. Several defendants have already pled guilty, while others remain fugitive. Federal officials describe the case as one of the most extensive cross-border firearm trafficking investigations in recent years. Federal prosecutors in New York announced a multi-major child exploitation prosecution this week. One case involves 42-year-old Andrew Ford of Stamford, Connecticut, accused of sexually exploiting a minor and transporting the victim across state lines for illegal sexual activity. Authorities allege Ford abused a 13-year-old victim in both New York and Connecticut and produced sexually explicit images after transporting the victim into Connecticut. Ford faces potential life imprisonment if convicted. Another shocking case involves Brian Cruz Solano, accused of sexually abusing a 12-year-old child and recording the abuse to exchange for other child pornography online. Federal investigators say Solano used Telegram and Snapchat to distribute videos of abuse while negotiating trade with other users. Authorities allege Solano admitted to abusing the victim approximately 25 times over the past year. Federal prosecutors say the investigation uncovered extensive digital evidence during the search of his residence. Federal prosecutors also announced the extradition of Rudy Sanchezin from the Dominican Republic. Authorities say Sanchezin operated an industrial-scale pill-pressing laboratory from a Manhattan apartment. Inside hidden compartments, investigators allegedly discovered approximately 37 pounds of methamphetamine and large-scale pill press operation capable of producing counterfeit narcotics. The case involves cooperation between the U.S. and Dominican authorities. Federal prosecutors also unveiled indictments against two North Moroccan nationals accused of operating an international Trump buck fraud scheme. Authorities allege the defendants falsely marketed fake financial products claiming affiliation with President Donald Trump and promised victims massive future payouts. Investigators say many victims were elderly Americans who collectively lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The defendants remain overseas and at large. In one of the most serious federal terrorism cases announced this month, prosecutors have charged Iraqi national Mohammed Bakr Saad Dawood al-Saadi with providing support to Iranian-backed terrorist organizations. Authorities say Ali Saadi coordinated attacks targeting American, Israeli, and Jewish interests throughout Europe and plotted additional attacks inside the United States. Federal investigators say Ali Sadi communicated with undercover operatives about targeting Jewish institutions in New York and elsewhere. He now faces multiple terrorism-related charges carrying a potential life sentence. Federal prosecutors in Massachusetts continue expanding their racketeering crackdown against notorious gangs. This week, gang member Wesley Lintago pled guilty to racketeering conspiracy and admitted to participating in machine gun shooting in Lynn that wounded two innocent women. Investigators say LaGuarrie used a fully automatic firearm during the attack. Federal officials say the broader investigation, known as Operation Paper Machete, has already led to dozens of charges tied to murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, narcotic trafficking, and firearm crimes. Another Trinitari's member, Derek Mercado, was sentenced to 37 months in prison after authorities recovered a loaded Uzi machete with an extended magazine containing 24 rounds. Investigators say Mercado was already wanted on unrelated warrants when officers located him carrying a green duffel bag containing the firearm. Federal prosecutors also announced the guilty plea of Patrick Van Colt, the former director of Playmount Public School Food Services. Authorities say Van Colt stole money and commercial kitchen equipment purchased with taxpayer and USDA funds to support his private seasonal restaurant business. Investigators allege that the theft scheme operated for more than a decade. Former federal employee Mo Kong Kang pled guilty after prosecutors accused him of fraudulently collecting pandemic unemployment benefits while employed full-time by the U.S. Department of Labor. Authorities say Kang falsified claims to unemployed during the COVID-19 pandemic while earning more than $85,000 annually. Federal prosecutors also announced an 11-year prison sentence for an Asian boys gang member, Isaiah Lyons. Authorities say Lyons helped distribute counterfeit Adderall pills made with methamphetamine throughout the Lowell area. Investigators allege the pills were sold in bulk quantities using encrypted message platforms. One of the harshest sentences handed down this month came in from Connecticut, when James Palaga received 50 years in federal prison for sexually exploiting multiple teenage girls across several states and countries. Federal investigators say Palago used Snapchat and TikTok to manipulate victims into becoming the prosecutors describe as sex slaves. Authorities say he coerced multiple teenage girls into producing illicit content while threatening violence against them and their families. Investigators also recovered thousands of additional child exploitation images involving infants and toddlers. Brian Joyce of Southington has been sentenced to more than 7 years in prison after investigators linked him to the sale of privately manufactured AR-15 rifles, ghost guns, marijuana, and ammunition. Authorities say Joyce repeatedly sold firearms to undercover officers and even offered access to fully automatic weapons. Federal prosecutors in Connecticut also announced a lengthy prison sentence in multiple fentanyl trafficking cases involving New Haven, Waterbury, Stamford, and Norfolk. Authorities continue warning that fentanyl remains one of the deadliest narcotic threats in the Northeast. Federal authorities in New Jersey announced what they describe as the largest methamphetamine seizure in the state history. Investigators seized more than 260 pounds of methamphetamine during a Homeland Security Task Force operation in Camden. Two men, Marco Cesar Acosta and Carlos Cordero Gonzalez, now face federal narcotic conspiracy charges. Authorities say the methamphetamine was hidden inside a container within the trunk when arrived in New Jersey from out of state. Federal officials say the seizure prevented a mass quantity of narcotics from entering communities across the region. A New York physical therapist pled guilty in Newark federal court for participating in an $11 million health care fraud scheme targeting Amtrak's health insurance plan. Investigators say the conspirators recruited Amtrak employees and paid kickbacks in exchange for allowing false medical claims to be submitted using their identities. 19 individuals have now pled guilty in the scheme. Federal prosecutors also announced the guilty plea of Michael Patrick Tax Jr., accused of constructing and detonating an improvised explosive device beneath his former supervisor's vehicle in Delaware, New Jersey. Authorities say Tax built the device using explosive chemicals and sharp lead-filled components after losing his job. Investigators allege he remotely detonated the investigation in an intimidation attempt. In Rhode Island, 53-year-old Jason Johnson pled guilty to wire fraud after falsifying presenting himself as a successful financial advisor. Prosecutors say Johnson convinced the couple to invest approximately $140,000 before diverting much of the money to personal spending. Federal prosecutors in Delaware announced that the sentencing of a nursing care business owner, John Kungu, to 18 months in prison for evading nearly $1.2 million in taxes. Authorities say Kungu concealed millions of dollars in accounts while falsely claiming inability to pay tax liabilities. A federal jury also convicted Damian Thompson of drug trafficking and firearm offenses after authorities discovered cocaine, fentanyl, marijuana, and loaded revolver tied to him during an undercover investigation. Federal prosecutors across Pennsylvania announced a series of major narcotic, firearm, and racketeering and child exploitation cases this week. Among them, a Pittsburgh man pled guilty to illegal possession of a loaded firearm despite multiple prior felony convictions. A Reading woman receives 7.5 years in prison for fentanyl and methamphetamine trafficking. A former inmate received additional prison time for running a prison racketeering operation involving bribed correctional officers and smuggling Suboxone. A Jamaican national was sentenced for operating an international lottery scheme targeting elderly victims. Federal prosecutors also announced indictments involving machine guns, online child exploitation, fentanyl trafficking, and threats against United States congressmen. Federal authorities across the Northeast continue warning that organized narcotic trafficking, online child exploitation, gang violence, fraud schemes, and transnational criminal operations remain among the most significant public safety threat facing the United States. From ghost guns and fentanyl pipelines to cyber exploitation networks and international terrorism investigation, federal prosecutors say these cases illustrate the increasingly complex challenges confronting law enforcement agencies nationwide. For Englebrook Independent News, I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Thank you for joining us in this mid-May 2026 Federal Crime Report. Stay safe. Good night.